For 40 years, every real estate agent in Harlow County knew one unspoken rule: don't list Ashwood Estate, it never closes. Eleanor Birch, 71 years old, steps into the basement of the old estate she was given after her grandfather's death, the one her family called a burden, the one they handed her while they divided the valuable land among themselves. Her nephew Craig took the farmland. Her cousins took the timber rights. Eleanor got the house nobody wanted. Harold Birch had built this house with his own hands in 1921. When he died, the family said he had gone senile in his final years. They said the house was worth nothing. They said Eleanor was lucky to get anything at all. That was 1984. For 40 years, 4 different agents had listed Ashwood Estate, and every single sale had died at the title search. Nobody ever knew why. Eleanor had spent 30 years as a county records clerk. She knew what hollow walls sounded like. She knew what missing instruments looked like in a filing log. And when she tapped the east basement wall looking for a water leak, and one section answered back with a sound that did not belong, she did not call a contractor. She went back to her car and got a small chisel. Behind 3 layers of plaster sealed inside a copper tube was a deed dated October 14, 1983. And written across the top in her grandfather's handwriting, steady and deliberate, not the hand of a confused man: this property is not to be sold. Not ever, unless Eleanor Birch says so. If you want to know what that one sentence did to 40 years of silence, stay with me, because this is where the story begins. Eleanor had lived in Harlow County her entire life. She had watched the seasons change from the same kitchen window, driven the same roads to the same office for 30 years, and known the names of half the families whose land records passed through her desk. She was not a woman who needed much, but she had always loved Ashwood Estate. Not because it was grand. It had not been grand for a very long time. She loved it because her grandfather had built it room by room, board by board, in a county where a man like Harold Birch, building anything at all, was itself a quiet act of will. She loved it because she remembered the smell of the kitchen on Sunday mornings when she was 7 years old. She loved it the way you love something that carries the weight of the people who are gone. So when the family gathered after Harold's affairs were finally settled in the spring of 1984, and her cousin leaned across the table and said, "You always loved that old place, Eleanor. It's yours," she understood exactly what was happening. Craig had already drafted the partition agreement. The farmland, 214 acres of it, went to him. The timber rights on the north parcel went to the cousins. The equipment, the vehicles, the remaining bank accounts divided cleanly among the people who had shown up with attorneys. Eleanor got the house. They said it like they were doing her a favor. She did not correct them. Craig pulled her aside before she could reach the door. He was already in his developer phase by then, already the kind of man who saw every piece of land as a transaction waiting to close. He put his hand on her shoulder and lowered his voice the way people do when they want to sound reasonable while telling you something that only benefits them. "Just sign it over to a developer," he said. "You'll get 30, maybe 40,000. That's more than it's worth." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She reached into her coat pocket, found a small notepad, and wrote down the number he had said. 30 to 40,000. She did not say why she was writing it. Craig watched her do it and said nothing more. That evening she drove out to Ashwood alone. The iron gate at the front of the property had not been painted in at least 20 years. The hinges had rusted to the color of dried blood, and the gate itself hung at an angle caught on a root that had pushed up through the gravel drive over the course of some quiet decade nobody had noticed. The elm trees that lined the entrance had grown into each other overhead, lacing their branches together until the drive looked less like an entrance and more like a tunnel. Eleanor parked and sat for a moment with the engine off. The house itself was 2 stories, white clapboard, gone gray, with paint peeling in long, uneven strips that curled away from the siding like pages of a book left in the rain. The porch railing had collapsed on the left side. One of the upper windows had a crack running from the corner to the center, held together by nothing but the tension in the glass. A crow sat on the peak of the roof and did not move when she got out of the car. She opened the garage on the east side of the house and found them almost immediately. 4 weathered for sale signs stacked neatly against the back wall like a set of encyclopedias nobody wanted anymore. Different brokerages, different decades. The oldest one had a phone number with only 7 digits. She stood there looking at them for a long time. It was Pamela Cole who had told her about the signs. Pamela was the 5th agent to ever list Ashwood Estate, and she had called Eleanor 3 days after the estate was settled, not to solicit the listing, but because she had always felt she owed someone an explanation. 4 agents before her, she said. 4 listings, 4 title searches, 4 deals that fell apart before they ever reached a closing table. Every title search on this estate, Pamela had said, comes back flagged. Same entry every time. Instrument 43471, filed October 1983, but the instrument itself, the actual document, nobody has ever been able to pull a copy. It shows up in the index, but when you request the filing, the record comes back restricted. Eleanor had listened without interrupting. She thanked Pamela and wrote that down too. Instrument 4471, filed 1983, restricted. Now she stood in the garage with her flashlight and looked at 4 decades of failed sales stacked against a wall, and she understood something she had not allowed herself to think clearly until this moment. She had spent 30 years reading property records for Harlow County. She had processed thousands of deed filings, title searches, instrument requests. She knew what it looked like when a filing came back clean. She knew what it looked like when something was missing. And she knew with the quiet certainty of someone who has read enough documents to understand what the absence of a document means, exactly what it meant when an instrument was filed but could not be copied. Someone had put a restriction on the filing itself, not on the property, on the record of the document. You only do that when you do not want the contents found, when you need something to exist legally to cast its effect, but stay invisible to anyone who does not already know exactly where to look. Eleanor clicked off her flashlight and stood in the dark of the garage for a moment. Then she picked up her flashlight again, walked past the 4 old signs, and went to find the basement door. The basement stairs at Ashwood were steeper than Eleanor remembered. She held the railing with one hand and her flashlight with the other, and took them slowly, the way she had learned to take things in the past few years, not from age exactly, but from the understanding that rushing rarely improved anything. The basement was exactly what 40 years of neglect looked like. The stone foundation walls were dark with moisture. The floor was bare concrete with a long crack running diagonally from the southeast corner toward the base of the main support beam, and the smell was the particular combination of old wood and standing water and time that Eleanor associated with county archive rooms and forgotten things. A single work light hung from a cord near the center of the ceiling. She found the pull chain, and the bulb came on, throwing a pale yellow circle across the floor and leaving the corners in shadow. She had told herself she was here to assess water damage. That was true as far as it went. She started at the north wall and worked her way around the perimeter, running her flashlight along the base of the foundation, noting where the moisture had wicked up through the stone, where the mortar had crumbled, where the floor showed the dark staining of water that had come and gone over many seasons. She was methodical about it. 30 years of reading records had made her methodical about most things. You start at one end, you move in one direction, and you do not skip sections because something looks unimportant. It was on the east wall that she stopped. There were drainage maps mounted in metal frames along that wall. She counted 6 of them. 5 were what she expected standard county drainage surveys from the 1940s, the kind of document that got framed and hung in basements all over Harlow County by men who took their land seriously and wanted the surveys close at hand. The paper was age-yellowed, the drafting lines faded to a soft brown, the kind of documents she had held in her hands hundreds of times in the archive room. The 6th frame was different. It was newer. Not new, but newer than the others by several decades at least. The metal of the frame had not aged the same way. The paper inside was a different weight, and it hung slightly lower than the 5 frames beside it. Not dramatically, just enough that someone measuring the wall with their eye, rather than a tape measure, would have noticed something was slightly off about the arrangement. Eleanor looked at it for a long time before she touched it. Then she leaned in close and looked at the drafting lines. She had spent 30 years in the same office where Harold Birch had worked decades before her. She had filed documents he had drafted, handled surveys he had prepared, seen his notations in the margins of old filings. A person's drafting style is as individual as their handwriting. The weight of the line, the way they lettered their coordinates, the particular angle at which they marked their datum points. She recognized his hand immediately. This map had been drawn by her grandfather. In 1983, according to the date in the lower right corner, the same year Harold Birch had been declared legally incompetent. The same year the family said he had stopped being able to manage his own affairs. The drafting lines were precise, the lettering was clean, the measurements were exacting. This was not the work of a man who had lost his mind. And this map had not been hung here for drainage purposes. The section it depicted did not correspond to any drainage feature she could identify. What it corresponded to, as far as she could determine, was exactly the section of east wall directly behind it. The frame covered approximately 4 feet of the original stone wall. Precisely 4 feet, measured. Her phone rang and she nearly dropped the flashlight. It was Vera. Eleanor, Vera said, and her voice was low in the way it got when she was standing near a window watching something she did not want to be seen watching. Craig was here this morning. He brought 2 men with him. They walked the property line and they took photographs. Eleanor waited. One of them, Vera said, was wearing a jacket from a demolition company. Eleanor thanked her and put the phone back in her pocket. She stood in the basement and looked at the frame on the east wall for another moment. Then she reached up with both hands, lifted it carefully from its hook, and leaned it against the adjacent wall. Behind the frame was a section of plaster that did not match the surrounding stone. The original foundation walls were rough-cut fieldstone set in gray mortar, uneven, and textured in the way of walls built by hand in 1921. The section behind the frame was plaster smooth tinted to approximate the color of the stone, around it textured on the surface with a tool meant to suggest the irregularity of the original wall. Someone had worked carefully to make it blend in. It did not quite match. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the plaster and held it there. Then she tapped. She moved 2 inches and tapped again. The third knock, the one closest to the corner, sounded different. Not hollow exactly, not empty the way a wall sounds when there is nothing behind it. Something else. A sound with weight to it. Density. The sound of a space that contained something rather than a space that contained nothing. Eleanor stood very still in the basement under the single work light and listened to the silence that followed that third knock. Then she thought about 2 men in a demolition company jacket walking her property line and taking photographs. And she thought about how long a plaster wall takes to come down once a crew decides to move. If you have ever been handed something your family dismissed as worthless, stay with us. Because Eleanor is about to find out exactly why her grandfather chose this house for her and not one of them. Hit subscribe and the bell. We release a new story every week, and you do not want to be the one who misses what is inside that wall. Eleanor did not break the wall. That was the first thing she decided, standing in the basement with her palms still pressed against the plaster. She was not here to destroy anything. She was here to read. That was what she had always done. You do not tear through a document. You open it carefully, follow its structure, let it show you what it contains, in the order it was meant to be understood. She swept her flashlight across the basement floor and found the toolbox in the far corner near the old furnace, a heavy steel box, dark green paint worn down to bare metal at the corners and along the handle. It had her grandfather's initials scratched into the side. HLHB. She crouched down and opened it. The tools inside were old but clean, not dusty the way everything else in this basement was dusty. Someone had wiped them down. The chisels were wrapped in a cloth that had dried stiff over the years, but had clearly been placed there with intention. She lifted the cloth and found a small, cold chisel underneath the kind used for precise work on plaster and mortar, not demolition detail work. The edge was still sharp. Eleanor sat back on her heels for a moment. She thought about her grandfather, 30 years a county records clerk. The same office she would later occupy, the same filing systems he had built and she had inherited and maintained. A man who understood documents, who understood that a thing properly filed, properly sealed, properly placed, could wait indefinitely for the right person to find it. A man who in 1983, in the same season his family was preparing to call him incompetent, had come down to this basement with a clean chisel and done something careful and deliberate in the east wall. She picked up the cold chisel and turned back to the wall. She started at the edge of the plaster patch where the newer material met the original stone. She worked slowly, following the seam, letting the chisel find the line of least resistance rather than forcing it. Plaster dust rose in the beam of her flashlight and drifted in the still basement air. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. 30 years of handling documents that could not be replaced had taught her that steadiness was not a physical quality. It was a decision you made before you touched something that mattered. The patch was approximately 18 inches wide and perhaps 2 feet tall, set into the wall at roughly chest height. She worked the perimeter first, loosening the edges, and then began carefully removing the face of the plaster in sections, each piece coming away clean, because she was patient, and because whoever had installed this patch had known what they were doing and had left a clean separation between the new material and the old stone behind it. She was on the 3rd section when she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. She did not turn around immediately. "Craig," she said. "Eleanor!" His voice was already tight. He was already moving across the basement toward her. "Stop. You are damaging property before legal transfer. That is destruction of assets." She turned and looked at him. He was standing 6 feet away, jaw-set eyes on the exposed wall cavity behind her and not on her face. His color was off. She had known Craig Birch for 47 years. She had watched him negotiate bluster charm and maneuver through more family situations than she could count. She knew what he looked like when he was performing concern, and she knew what he looked like when he was genuinely afraid. This was the second one. "Before legal transfer," she said quietly. She set the chisel down on top of the toolbox very deliberately and looked at him. "You've started the paperwork." It was not a question. Craig opened his mouth and then closed it again. His eyes went back to the wall. Eleanor turned back to the wall as well. In the cavity behind the plaster, seated in a recess that had been cut into the original stone with the same deliberate precision as everything else her grandfather had done in this space, was a copper tube. Approximately 12 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, green with age, the deep, uneven patina of copper that has sat undisturbed for decades. Both ends were sealed. She reached in and lifted it out carefully. The tube was heavier than it looked. She turned it slowly in the beam of her flashlight and examined the seals. Red wax still intact after 40 years, pressed into smooth discs at each end and stamped into the wax, clear and unmistakable even after 4 decades. The official seal of the Harlow County Recorder's Office. She tilted the tube toward the light and found the date pressed into the wax beside the seal. October 17, 1983. She stood very still. October 1983 was the same month Harold Birch's family had filed the petition declaring him legally incompetent. She knew the timeline because she had looked it up 3 days ago, the same afternoon Pamela Cole had mentioned instrument 4471 on the phone. Old habit. When something in a filing did not make sense, you checked the surrounding dates. She looked at the seal again. The Harlow County Recorder's Office. Official, notarized, sealed by the office itself, which meant someone at the recorder's office had been present when this was prepared. Someone had witnessed this. Behind her, Craig had not moved. She could hear him breathing. The tube was sealed with red wax, she said aloud, not to Craig, not to anyone in particular, stamped with the county seal. And the date is October 17, 1983. She heard Craig exhale slowly. The same month, she continued, your grandfather was declared legally incompetent by his own family. The basement was very quiet. She held the copper tube in both hands and looked at the official seal pressed into the wax. And she thought about a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how documents worked, exactly how filings were structured, exactly how a properly sealed instrument could sit in a county index for 40 years, casting its legal effect over every title search, waiting in perfect silence for the one person in the family who would know what it meant, the person he had left the house to. Eleanor carried the copper tube upstairs to the kitchen. She set it on the table, the same kitchen table that had been in this house since 1947, a heavy oak piece with a surface worn smooth by decades of meals and documents and hands resting on it while people thought through difficult things. She pulled out a chair and sat down. She set her flashlight to one side and looked at the tube for a moment in the late afternoon light coming through the window. Then she broke the wax seal on the near end. She had expected resistance. The wax had held for 40 years. But it came away cleanly in 2 pieces, as if it had been waiting to be opened and had simply been patient about it. She set the pieces aside and tilted the tube carefully. The document inside had been rolled and wrapped in a thin oilskin cloth, the kind used for protecting papers against moisture, the kind a man who understood documents would choose without having to think about it. She drew it out slowly and unrolled it on the table, using the flashlight and her coffee cup to weight the corners. It was 4 pages, typed on a manual typewriter, the kind of clean, deliberate typing that came from someone who had composed their thoughts completely before they sat down at the keys. The heading at the top of the first page read, Deed Restriction Covenant, Ashwood Estate, Harlow County. Below that, the legal description of the property, precise to the foot, matching the original 1921 deed. Below that, the terms. Eleanor read slowly. She read the way she had always read documents that mattered, not skimming for the general sense, but following each clause to its end, understanding how each provision connected to the next, letting the structure of the language show her what the person who wrote it had understood about how these things worked. The covenant was complete, fully executed. The terms were unambiguous. Ashwood Estate could not be sold, transferred, mortgaged, subdivided, encumbered, or in any way alienated from its current ownership without the express written consent of Eleanor Birch. Not Eleanor Birch or her assigns, not Eleanor Birch or the surviving heirs. Eleanor Birch, named specifically by full legal name, with her date of birth included to eliminate any question of identity. The restriction ran with the land. It was permanent and binding on all subsequent title holders, regardless of how title was acquired or transferred. At the bottom of the first page in the margin, someone had added a handwritten note in the same precise lettering she had seen on the drainage map downstairs. It read simply, filed as a restrictive covenant pursuant to Section 14 Instrument Index restricted per standing order. The notation was initialed HB. He had filed it himself. He had known exactly which provision to invoke to restrict access to the instrument in the county index. He had known that the document would appear in every title search as Instrument 4471, flagging the property, blocking every sale, without the contents ever being visible to the agents or attorneys running those searches. The instrument existed. Its effect was real and legally enforceable, but its contents were sealed from casual inquiry. For 40 years, it had done exactly what he designed it to do. Eleanor turned to the signature page. Harold James Birch. The signature was clear and steady. The letters formed with the unhurried precision of a man who had signed official documents for decades and understood that a signature on something like this was not a formality. Below his signature, the notary seal dated October 14, 1983, with the notary's commission information complete and legible. Below that, 2 witness signatures, neither of them family members, both with addresses in Harlow County that she recognized as being from the older part of town, the part where people who had known Harold Birch for a long time had lived. He had chosen his witnesses carefully. She turned to the reverse of the last page and held it toward the window for better light. There in pencil, faint but legible, written in her grandfather's hand, "She will know what this means. She is the only one who will." Eleanor read it once. She read it again. She read it a 3rd time, and somewhere in the reading of it the 3rd time, the full weight of what she was holding arrived in her chest all at once, not as a legal fact, but as a human one. Her grandfather, in the last clear months of his life, had not been confused or frightened or retreating from the world. He had been working. He had been in this house in that basement with a clean chisel and a copper tube and a document he had typed himself sealing something into a wall, with the patience and precision of a man who understood that the right document properly placed, properly filed, could outlast everything that came after it. He had known what was coming. He had known the family would move against him. And before they could, he had built something they could not undo. He had built it for her. She became aware that Craig was standing in the kitchen doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. "Let me see it," he said. His voice was careful, measured in the way of someone working to keep it that way. Eleanor placed her hand flat on the document. "I will call Thomas first," she said. Craig looked at her hand on the paper. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there held him in place for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, and she heard the front door open and close and his car start in the drive. She waited until she heard him reach the road. Then she picked up her phone and called Thomas Holbrook. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. Thomas arrived at 4:52. He would later tell her in the careful, understated way of a man who had practiced law for 35 years and did not use words carelessly that he could not recall driving quite that quickly to see a deed. Thomas Holbrook has been handling property law in Harlow County for 35 years. When Eleanor read him the filing date over the phone, he went completely quiet. Before we tell you what he said, drop a comment right now. Do you think a deed restriction like this holds up after 40 years? Write your answer below. We want to know what you think before the answer comes. Thomas Holbrook read the covenant once without speaking. Then he read it again. Eleanor sat across the kitchen table and watched him. She had known Thomas for many years, not as a close friend, but as a professional, the kind of acquaintance built over decades of working in adjacent offices in a small county where everyone in land records and property law eventually knew everyone else. She had seen him read documents before. She had never seen him read one twice. When he finished the second reading, he set it down carefully on the table and looked at it for a moment as if it might say something further. "This is fully executed," he said. "The notarization is valid. The witnesses are independent. The covenant language is precise and unambiguous." Eleanor waited. "The filing restriction," he said, quieter now. He tapped the margin notation her grandfather had made. Section 14. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a man improvising. This was a man who understood the recording system from the inside. He looked up at her. "I need to call Doris," he said. He dialed the county recorder's office from Eleanor's kitchen table and asked for the archive department. Doris Fenn picked up on the second ring. Thomas explained what he needed in the measured economical language of someone who has made thousands of professional calls and knows how to communicate urgency without performing it. He needed the original entry log for October 1983, instrument 4471. He needed the filing date confirmed from the physical log, not the index. There was a pause while Doris pulled the record. Eleanor looked out the kitchen window at the elm trees in the front yard and listened to the quiet sound of paper being handled on the other end of the line. Doris came back on. "Instrument 4471, she said. Her voice was even and professional in the way of someone who has spent 22 years in a county archive and has learned to read documents without editorializing. Filed and accepted October 14th, 1983. Deed restriction covenant. Restricted per Standing Order Section 14, original instrument sealed at filing." Thomas wrote the date on his legal pad and circled it. "Doris," he said, "I need one more date. Harold James Birch, incompetency petition. When was it filed?" Another pause, longer this time. Eleanor heard the sound of a different drawer opening, a different log being lifted and set on a surface. "Birch Harold James," Doris said, "incompetency petition, filed October 28, 1983. Thomas's pen stopped moving. The kitchen was very quiet. "October 28th, Eleanor said. 14 days, Thomas said. He said it to himself, not to her, the way a person speaks when they are working through something and need to hear it in the air to be certain of it. He looked at the document on the table, and then he looked at Eleanor, and she could see in his face the same thing she had been sitting with since she turned over the last page of the covenant and read the penciled note on the back. Not surprise exactly, something heavier than surprise, the particular weight of a thing that has been wrong for 40 years and is only now in this kitchen in this light being correctly named. Harold Birch had filed this covenant on October 14th. It had been accepted sealed and entered into the county record. It was legally binding from the moment it was filed. 14 days later, someone had filed a petition to have him declared legally incompetent. If the incompetency declaration had come first, a legal challenge to the covenant might have been possible. A court might have found grounds to question his capacity at the time of execution, but it had not come first. The covenant had been filed and accepted and was already part of the permanent county record before the petition was ever submitted. Whoever had filed that petition had been too late. Thomas looked at his legal pad. He turned his pen over once in his fingers. A small, precise gesture she had learned meant he was about to ask something he already suspected the answer to. "Doris," he said, "the incompetency petition. Who filed it?" The pause this time was brief. "Filed by Doris said," and Eleanor heard something in her voice shift by a fraction, the almost imperceptible hesitation of a professional who has just read something that has a human weight to it. "Raymond Birch." Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the table. Raymond Birch was Craig's father, Eleanor's older brother, the man who had sat at the head of the table in 1984 and directed the division of the estate with the calm authority of someone who had been planning it for a while. The man who had taken the farmland and the timber rights and the bank accounts and handed Eleanor the house with a sentence about how she had always loved it. Thomas thanked Doris and ended the call. He sat for a moment with his pen on the legal pad and did not write anything. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Did Craig know?" she said. It was not quite a question. Thomas looked at the covenant on the table between them. He looked at the circled date on his legal pad. He looked at the margin of the window where the late afternoon light was beginning to change. "He had been trying to buy this property from you," Thomas said carefully. "Below market twice. He knows every sale has failed at the title search. He knows the instrument number. He grew up in this family." Eleanor nodded once. She thought about Craig in the basement doorway, his color wrong, his voice too fast, his eyes going immediately to the exposed cavity in the wall before he had even looked at her face. She thought about his exact words. "Before legal transfer. Not if you sell. Not when we transfer. Before. Present tense. Active paperwork." She thought about 40 years of failed sales, 4 agents, dozens of interested buyers, not one successful closing, every deal dying at the same moment, the same instrument number appearing in the same title search, the same request for the document coming back, restricted the same confusion, the same quiet dissolution of another attempted transaction. Not bad luck, not a difficult property, not a coincidence that had persisted for 4 decades. A covenant doing exactly and only what Harold Birch had designed it to do, waiting in the county record with the patience of a filed document, which is to say indefinitely for the one person he had named in it to find it. Thomas clicked his pen and turned to a fresh page on his legal pad. "All right," he said, "let me tell you what this means going forward." Pamela Cole had been driving when Thomas called her. She arrived 20 minutes later, still in her coat, a practical gray wool that Eleanor recognized from years of seeing Pamela walk the neighborhoods of Harlow County with the measured, purposeful stride of a woman who had spent her career on her feet. Pamela was 54, but carried herself like someone who had seen enough of the world's small disappointments to have stopped being surprised by most things. Ashwood Estate had been the exception. Eleanor could see it in the way Pamela's eyes went immediately to the document on the table when she came through the kitchen door. Thomas slid the original county entry log across the table toward her. He had printed it from the recorder's office digital archive, while Eleanor made coffee a single page showing the October 1983 filing entries in the order they had been recorded. Pamela sat down and read it. Eleanor watched her face. "There it is," Pamela said quietly. She set the page down and looked at it for a moment longer. Then she looked up at Eleanor and Thomas. "Every title search I ever ran on this property came back with the same flag. Instrument 4471, filed October 1983, and beneath the instrument number always the same notation. Filed original not available for copying." She shook her head slowly. "I requested a copy of that instrument 4 times over 20 years, she said. "Different methods?" different staff members at the recorder's office, every time the same response. The instrument exists in the index, but the original has a filing restriction. It cannot be disclosed or copied without consent of the named party. Thomas nodded. He was writing on his legal pad again. What none of us ever knew, Pamela continued, is who the named party was. The restriction itself was filed in a way that kept the named party confidential. You could see that a restriction existed. You could not see whose consent was required to lift it. She looked at Eleanor. "It was your name," Eleanor said. Pamela was quiet for a moment. "Your name," Thomas confirmed. Eleanor Birch, named specifically in the filing restriction with her date of birth. Placed there in 1983. Pamela sat back in her chair. She looked at the copper tube standing upright on the table beside the covenant, cleaned now, the aged patina of it catching the late afternoon light from the window. Eleanor had been 31 years old in 1983. She had been working in the county records office for 3 years. She had been learning the filing systems that her grandfather had spent decades mastering before her. Harold Birch had placed her name on a filing restriction on an instrument whose contents would have ended 40 years of confusion, protected the estate from dozens of failed transactions, and given Eleanor complete legal authority over the property. And he had placed it there when she was 31 years old, 30 years before she would retire, 40 years before she would stand in the basement with a cold chisel and find what he had left for her. He had not expected her to find it quickly. He had built it to wait. The sound of a car in the drive came through the window. Eleanor recognized the engine before she heard the door open. Craig came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw Pamela and Thomas at the table. He looked at the covenant. He looked at the copper tube. He looked at Eleanor. Something in his face had changed since he had walked out 2 hours earlier. The tightness around his jaw was still there, but the energy behind it was different. He did not look like a man preparing to argue. He looked like a man who had been sitting in his car deciding how much to say. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "He told me. In 1984, right before he died, he said the house would protect itself." Nobody spoke. Craig looked at the table. He said the words carefully, the way you say something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. "I thought he was losing his mind." He paused. "I didn't think he meant it literally." Eleanor looked at her nephew for a long time. Vera appeared in the doorway behind Craig, having come in the back the way she always had for 30 years. She crossed the kitchen without speaking and stood behind Eleanor's chair and placed her hand on Eleanor's shoulder and stayed there. The kitchen was very still. Late afternoon light came through the dusty windows at a low angle, falling across the oak table, across the covenant and the copper tube and Thomas's legal pad, covered in notes across the faces of the people sitting in the house that Harold Birch had built in 1921 and spent the last months of his life protecting. Eleanor looked at her nephew. She thought about 40 years of Craig watching the covenant work, 40 years of watching every title search flag the same instrument, 40 years of watching buyers walk away, confused agents give up the property, sit unsold in a county index, doing quietly and persistently exactly what it had been designed to do. 40 years of knowing. She thought about Craig's offer. 30, maybe 40,000. That's more than it's worth. Said to a woman who did not yet know that her name was on a filing restriction that gave her sole authority over the property's future. She thought about what it meant that he had made that offer not once but twice. The answer was already in his face when he had said what he said. He had not stayed silent to protect his father's memory, though perhaps he had told himself that over the years. He had not stayed silent out of cruelty, not exactly. He had stayed silent because as long as Eleanor did not know what the covenant contained, she could not use it. And for 40 years, that had been exactly the position he needed her in. A woman who owned a property she believed was worthless, whose name was on a document she had never read, sitting on an authority she did not know she had. The copper tube stood upright on the table between them in the late afternoon light. Harold Birch filed that deed on October 14, 1983. Eleanor found it on an afternoon in 2024, 41 years, exactly as he had planned. He had not known when she would find it. He had only known that she would. If this story moves you the way it moved us, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. because sometimes the people we love protect us in ways we do not discover until much, much later. Thomas did not rush the explanation. He had been a property attorney in Harlow County for 35 years, and he understood that the moment when a legal truth fully arrives in the room is not a moment to move through quickly. He set down his pen and spoke in the measured, unhurried way of a man who has learned that the weight of a fact is best communicated by giving it space. The covenant, he said, is a deed restriction running with the land. In this state, there is no statute of limitations on a properly filed and recorded deed restriction. It does not expire. It does not weaken with time. It does not become unenforceable because nobody acted on it for 40 years. It has been part of the legal title to this property since October 14, 1983, and it remains so today with the same force it had the day it was filed. He looked at Craig briefly and then back at the legal pad. What that means practically, he continued, is that no sale, no transfer, no mortgage, no subdivision, no demolition permit, and no development application affecting Ashwood Estate can proceed without Eleanor's written consent. Not a contractor, not a buyer, not a municipality, not an adjacent landowner requiring access. Nobody. He let that last word settle. Eleanor was watching Thomas, but she was aware of Craig across the table. She was aware of the precise quality of his stillness. Thomas looked down at his notes and turned a page. "There is one additional matter," he said. He did not look at Craig when he said it. "I pulled the county development filings this afternoon while I was waiting for Doris to call back. Craig's current project on the north parcel of the Birch family land, the mixed-use development he filed preliminary applications for 18 months ago, requires access through Ashwood's North Road. That road runs entirely within the boundaries of Ashwood Estate." The kitchen was very quiet. Without Eleanor's written consent, Thomas said the project cannot obtain its access permit. Without the access permit, it cannot break ground. The application has been sitting in review for 7 months. The county has been waiting on the access documentation. Craig was looking at the table. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the North Road. She had walked it as a child, a long gravel lane running along the tree line at the back of the property, connecting the estate to the north parcel where the old equipment barn had stood. She had not thought about that road in years. She did not imagine Craig had been thinking about it in terms of what it meant to her. He had been thinking about it in terms of what it meant to him. He had never needed her signature more than he needed it right now. He just had not known she knew. Thomas set his pen down and stepped back from the table, giving them space the way a good attorney does when the legal facts have been stated, and the human conversation needs to begin without him in the middle of it. Eleanor sat with what she now knew for a long moment. She thought about the 1984 table. Craig's father Raymond at the head of it, calm and organized the partition agreement already drafted, the attorneys already briefed. She thought about her own father sitting quietly on the far side, accepting what was offered, not asking questions. She thought about herself 32 years old, being handed a house that everyone in the room had already decided was the worthless portion, being told she was lucky to get anything excepting the keys without argument because she had always loved that old place and did not yet understand that love was being used as a reason to give her less. She thought about Harold Birch in October of 1983 in this house in that basement, knowing what was coming, knowing his son Raymond had already begun to move against him, knowing the family was preparing to divide what he had spent his life building, knowing he could not stop it, but knowing something else. He knew they would give her this house. They would give it to her because she loved it, and because they had calculated it was worth the least, and because she was the one who would not argue. He knew they would think it was worthless. He knew she would be the one left holding it because she had always been the one who stayed in the county, who stayed in the office, who stayed near him in the years when others had already left to build their own separate lives in separate places. She had been the one who visited on Sunday mornings when she was 7 years old and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke. She had been the one who followed him into the records office, who sat at his desk, who learned his filing systems, who carried on his work without knowing that was what she was doing. He had known all of it. She looked at the covenant on the table, at his signature on the last page, steady and deliberate, at the penciled words on the back that she did not need to read again because she already knew them by heart. She will know what this means. She is the only one who will. He had not protected this house because it was the most valuable piece of land. The farmland was more valuable. The timber rights were more valuable. The bank accounts were immediate. He had protected this house because he knew Eleanor was the only one in the family who would have protected him back, who had protected him back in the small daily ways that do not get recorded anywhere, but that a person who is loved can feel clearly. And he had wanted to say thank you in the only language he fully trusted: property, law, and 40 years of patience. Craig looked up from the table. "What do you want?" he said. It was not the negotiator's voice she had heard in the basement. It was quieter than that. The question of a man who has run out of positions and is finally asking a real question. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Through the window behind him she could see the grounds of Ashwood Estate in the late afternoon light, the overgrown iron gate, the elm trees with their interlocked branches, the peeling clapboard that needed paint and the porch railing that needed repair, and the crow that had been on the roof earlier and was gone now. She looked at all of it, and for the first time since she had driven through that gate, it did not look neglected to her. It looked like something that had been preserved, like something that had waited with the particular dignity of things that are built well and maintained by their own internal structure for the moment when waiting was no longer necessary. She turned back to Craig. "I want the truth in writing first," she said. "Then we will talk." Eleanor did not make her decision at the kitchen table. She made it the following morning alone, walking the grounds of Ashwood Estate in the early light before anyone else arrived. The grass was heavy with dew, and the elm trees along the drive held the morning mist in their upper branches, and the whole property had the particular quiet of a place that has been still for a long time and is only now beginning to hear itself again. She walked the perimeter slowly, the way she had walked the perimeter of the basement wall with her flashlight methodically, without hurrying, letting the place show her what it contained. She walked the north road last. It was a long gravel lane running along the tree line at the back of the property, exactly as she remembered it from childhood. Overgrown at the edges, but solid underneath, the kind of road built by someone who understood that good work outlasts the person who does it. She walked its full length to the boundary with the north parcel and stood there for a moment looking at the land beyond it, the land Craig had been building toward for 2 years, and she thought about what her grandfather had understood about access and dependency and the quiet power of a well-placed boundary. Then she walked back to the house and called Thomas. The agreement took 11 days to draft. Eleanor had conditions, and she did not negotiate them down. The first was full legal acknowledgement of the covenant's validity, entered into the county record, signed by Craig and witnessed by Thomas and filed under Harold Birch's original instrument number, so that the 2 documents would be linked in the county archive for as long as the archive existed. The second was the restoration of all historical Birch family property records to the Harlow County Historical Collection documents that had been removed from the archive during the estate division in 1984 and had been in private possession since. The third condition was the one that had come to her on the morning walk standing at the end of the North Road. A formal letter of acknowledgement, signed by Craig Birch, entered into the county record, stating that Harold James Birch was of sound mind and deliberate purpose when he filed the deed restriction covenant on October 14, 1983. Not a legal opinion, a family statement, signed and filed and permanent. Craig signed all 3 documents without attempting to renegotiate any of them. Thomas arranged for an independent appraisal of Ashwood Estate once the access road question was resolved. The appraiser came on a Wednesday morning and spent 4 hours on the property. His report arrived the following week. With the North Road access established and the covenant's clarity confirmed, the development potential of the estate was valued at $2.1 million. Eleanor read the appraisal, once set it on the kitchen table beside the copper tube, and picked up the phone. She called the Harlow County Historical Preservation Fund and spoke with their director for 40 minutes. The donation she arranged represented the full difference between the appraised value and the price Craig had offered her twice. She made it in Harold Birch's name. The fund director asked if she wanted a public acknowledgement. She said she wanted a small bronze plaque. She told him exactly where she wanted it placed. On the day the agreement was finalized, Craig came to the house one last time to collect his copies of the signed documents. Thomas was present. Vera was in the kitchen. Eleanor stood in the front room with the signed papers in a manila envelope and waited while Craig put on his coat. He stopped at the door. He did not turn around immediately. He stood with his hand on the frame, the way people stand when they are working up to something they have been carrying for a long time. "I should have told you," he said. "Years ago. I'm sorry." Eleanor looked at the back of his coat. She thought about 40 years. She thought about a man sitting in the back of a room in 1984, listening to his father divide an estate, and knowing what his grandfather had done, and choosing in that moment and in every moment that followed to keep that knowledge to himself. She thought about what that choice had cost Craig over the years, whether it had cost him anything, whether a person could carry a thing like that without feeling its weight eventually. She thought about her grandfather in the basement with a clean chisel and a copper tube, making a different kind of choice. "I know," she said. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Craig left. Thomas gathered his papers. Vera made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table for a while without talking very much, which was the most comfortable kind of conversation Eleanor had ever known. In the weeks that followed, she had the porch railing repaired. She had the clapboard siding painted the same white it had been in 1921 when Harold Birch had first put it up, a warm, clean white that caught the morning light and held it. She had the iron gate re-hung level on new hinges so that it opened and closed the way a gate was meant to. She did not renovate. She did not modernize. She simply took care of what had been waiting for care, the way you attend to something that has been patient with you. The copper tube she cleaned carefully and placed on the mantelpiece in the front room upright, positioned where the morning light from the east window would reach it. It looked exactly like what it was, an artifact, something made with intention, sealed with care, kept in good faith across 4 decades, waiting to be understood by the right person at the right time. On a Thursday morning in early November, Eleanor drove to the Harlow County Records office on the same route she had driven for 30 years. She parked in the lot and walked to the archive entrance and stood for a moment looking at the small bronze plaque that had been mounted beside the door the previous week. Harold Birch, records clerk, 1948 to 1979. He believed in the truth of documents. She stood there for a while in the cool morning air. She thought about a man who had understood more deeply than most that a document properly filed and properly kept was a form of trust, that the archive was not a storage room, but a promise, that the things you recorded carefully, the things you sealed with intention and placed in the right hands of the right system, could outlast the people who tried to undo them, outlast the confusion and the maneuvering and the table where the estate was divided, and the family that thought it had taken the most valuable parts. A deed does not forget. A filing does not expire. A covenant placed in the county record by a man who knew exactly what he was doing does not weaken because time passes. The old estate that nobody could sell for 40 years, it was not cursed, it was not forgotten, it was not the leftover piece that nobody wanted. It was waiting. With the particular patience of a well-filed document and a well-built house, and a man who trusted one person, completely waiting for the morning when Eleanor Birch would stand in a basement with a cold chisel and finally read what he had written for her. And only her. Harold Birch didn't hide that deed because he was losing his mind. He hid it because he trusted exactly one person to find it at exactly the right time. Every week on this channel we find another old house that has been keeping a secret. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week's story starts with a locked room that has not been opened in 63 years. And the key was mailed to the wrong address.